conversation is going to be a real treat for me and hopefully eye-opening for many of you in the audience. Last year, actually, was it last year? Maybe the year before. Anyway, I lose track of time. I was approached by our next guest and asked to appear, actually originally asked to do a tabletop exercise on the theory of what would happen if January 6th happened again, only this time the military was compromised. And I'll let Janessa talk to you about how that theory came up and why this was significant for Vote Vets Foundation to actually or Vet Voice Foundation to actually be engaged in this. But it gave me a chance to get to know some great new friends. We were just remarking in the kind of green room here, how much fun we've had hanging out together, and how great it is that there's no prima donnas in this film, and everybody is really linked and committed to doing it. But I want to introduce you first to Janessa Golbeck. She is the CEO of Vet Voice, a national nonprofit that advocates for veterans and military families to actively participate in our democracy. As a Marine Corps combat engineer officer, she led missions overseas and supported service members as an uninformed victim advocate. Her advocacy includes challenging the combat exclusion policy, and we'll let her talk a little bit more about that when we get together, and contributing to its repeal and allowing all qualified applicants, regardless of gender, to serve in all military roles. Before serving in the military, Janessa led efforts to protect civilians in combat zones as a human rights advocate. Janessa, it's so good to be back with you. We've had so much fun together. What I didn't know when you guys asked me to do this, and we'll let you cue up kind of what the exercise was, is that I would end up falling in love with so many people and making such great new friends. And I count you among them. You are truly an American patriot, and I mean that in the most sincere terms. So, Janessa, tell us a little bit about why you guys did this, how you did it, and how it got turned into a movie.
Well, likewise, Senator, it's been a pleasure getting to work with and get to know you. And for the record, you are my wife's favorite cast member because you just keep it real all the time. And she had a great time hanging with you at Sundance. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit about the project here. So let's see, back in 2021, after January 6th occurred, the organization that I lead, Vet Voice Foundation, we have a network of general officers around the country who participate in it as advisors, often on our legislative efforts on the Hill, and are very helpful in many other ways. But they expressed a lot of concern about the disproportionate number of veterans and military folks who participated in the insurrection. And as a way to really call out this rising problem in our society, they wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post that said, we're really concerned about the rise of extremism, not just in society writ large, but in the active duty forces and in the veterans community. And they challenged the administration to take a more proactive and tangible role in addressing that problem. And one of their recommendations was for the administration to conduct a multi-agency tabletop that looked at what happens if we have another contested election, and this time the losing candidate calls on members of the military to actually help them take power. And the scenario focused on a very small group of members of the military who betrayed their oath. And we wanted to really peel back. What would some of the operational issues be, constitutional issues, and find out what are norms that we rely on rather than laws? Where are there gray areas in our law? What happens in this scenario, both all the way at the federal government, all the way down to the state? And so we brought together about 35 members of the past 5 presidential administrations, and folks like Senator Heidi Heitkamp, Governor Steve Bullock, who played our president, General Wes Clark, and many others, as well as former members of the Trump administration, to role play a 6-hour unscripted scenario based on what I just described.
Janessa, I think I'm going to stop you there.
Sure.
And we're going to roll what we can.
Great. Good.
Because you did such a great job setting it up.
My fellow Americans, it is undeniable that this past election was stolen, To all those members of the armed forces, join with us to defend our liberty and land. Should I be friendlier?
No.
Well, I'm going to join up.
You guys happy with that? Seated around this room is an incredible diversity of professional experience spanning the last 5 presidential administrations. Most of you have sworn under oath to defend the Constitution. What happens when those in uniform break that oath?
January 6th demonstrated a possible false sense of security.
The next insurrection could involve members of the active duty military turning their weapons around on the folks that they're there to protect. One of the recommendations was to war game what that might look like.
I am President Hotham, Chief Executive of the United States of America.
You have 6 hours to avert a civil war and ensure the peaceful transfer of power. Mr. President, we are going to be starting the game in 3.
We are here to stress test our national security system.
1.
I want them to be prepared for the worst case scenarios.
I have no idea if, at the end of this exercise, this country collapses or comes together.
Where would we like to send a large body of armed crazies? Capitol.
You are confirming that there are National Guard that have in fact let protesters through.
I'm going to flood the zone with fake pictures, guys.
Very difficult to find out what is real and what is.
And there were actual
Guys,
images of that?
It is not compromising the proceedings of the election.
Yeah, it is compromising the proceedings of the election. The entire Congress is still in a bunker.
Now they're playing the game.
Everybody back to the table.
You can authorize lethal force.
Pause for just a second. Is that correct? You could have federal...
We've done it on the southwest border.
He's going to have to make a decision.
Put your f***ing cards on the table.
The United States could be on the brink of a second civil war.
You've pissed off a lot of senior ranking folks from all 5 presidential administrations.
Doing my job.
Great job.
There it is, Janessa. Every time I watch it, and I do get tired of watching it, I hear something different, and I just think it is so important. Here's what I've been saying, and you've been with me, and so bear with me because I know it gets boring to hear me say the same thing over and over again. People, when we do the post analysis, kind of people watch it, and then we allow the audience a chance to talk to some of the participants. And the question that's always asked is, why did you do it? Because it's not without some political risk to those of us who have been in politics, those great public servants who are still in their careers. And I always say, because we're being gaslit. We're being told over and over again that what you saw on January 6th didn't really happen. And of course, it'll never happen again. And I think that preparation, we hope to God it never happens again, but preparation is such a huge part of that. Can you talk about, not just the movie and how it's gotten a lot of attention, including a nomination at Sundance, but talk about as a Marine, what this means to you and why you were willing to raise the alarm that this could happen in the military. Why are you involved?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, for me, the reality is that this is a known issue. Like you said, this isn't something that didn't happen or isn't happening. We know that there are that veterans and folks in the military in particular are being targeted for recruitment into extremist organizations because they are one of the last groups in American society that have cross-partisan respect and appeal. And so they can become incredibly effective vectors for misinformation and disinformation. And so we've watched over the past few years as bipartisan commissions on this have become politicized and weaponized, how there are those in Congress who say it's disrespectful to the troops to even suggest that folks might be involved in extremist activity. I'm a big believer, if you love something, leave it better than you found it, work to make it stronger. It's okay to identify a weakness and work to fix it. And who better to raise this alarm than veterans ourselves and say, look, we acknowledge this problem exists and we want folks to do something about it. And, people might be watching who just tuned into this and asking how did you go from a war game to a documentary that looks like what you just showed us in that trailer? a major Hollywood endeavor. And the reality is that we started talking about this with friends of ours and partners in the space, and many of them said, it's good to produce a report that you can provide to the administration with recommendations they can take. But this is an issue that the public doesn't necessarily have an entry point into or a way to discuss it. And so we thought long and hard about how do we put this in front of people, and putting it on film and putting it on camera was the way that we decided to attack that issue. And like you said, it wasn't easy for people to say yes, like asking people like yourself or 4-star generals to appear on camera in an unscripted exercise with a bunch of Hollywood folks, over their shoulder the entire time. Not only a risk, reputational risk, but also truly a physical risk. A lot of people who participate in the film have been the targets of extremist violence and swatting and all of that. So a lot of moral courage involved with everybody who decided to participate.
Absolutely. And I just want to give people a sense, there's the blue cell. It's not intended blue or red. This is the typical kind of language, but the blue cell, which is the administration. And that's what you saw kind of in this trailer. But you also saw some folks who looked like they were behind the scenes causing mischief. They were the red cell. And to me, when you all get a chance to view this film, I think you're going to be intrigued most with the people and the history of the red cell. Can you talk a little bit about how you found those folks and their willingness to participate and what they're working on right now to kind of sound the alarm?
Absolutely. Well, our red cell was led by a gentleman named Chris Goldsmith, who is a veteran, U.S. Army veteran, and a longtime friend of mine. We've known each other for over a decade. Chris has been involved in a number of efforts to both raise alarm about the lack of care that veterans were given upon returning home, combat veterans in particular. He's done a ton of work in this space as a veterans advocate, and for the last several years has really honed in on extremist recruitment out of the veterans and military community. And he and his team, actually, of other veterans, do a lot of work that has been covered in publications like Rolling Stone and the New York Times. I encourage you to Google him and his team. But they monitor and infiltrate real-world extremist groups and provide that information to the general public, to law enforcement agencies, and to folks who are potentially, targets for extremist violence. And so getting him involved was really important because we wanted to have people who are running the red cell who really understood the thinking and mentality and tactics, how to use social media in a way that overwhelmed the administration's ability to respond, how to flood the zone, so to speak, with disinformation and misinformation, how to goad the government and administration officials into response for something that maybe didn't need as big of a response to. And so I think one of the most powerful aspects of the film and the people involved were our red cell participants who, at great personal cost to themselves, have dedicated their professional lives to solving this problem and to raising public awareness of it.
Yeah, and Steve Bullock, Governor Bullock, who played the president in our exercise, gives people a real wake-up call when he talks about the highway patrol. And so I want to segue into, this isn't just the military, we're also seeing it in former law enforcement officials, although my experience with law enforcement is a large number of people coming to law enforcement come to us from the military, and they do great work. And so we don't need to take a broad brushstroke and say this is a 90% problem in the military or in law enforcement, but we know from the numbers of people who were prosecuted after January 6th that there is a disproportionate number. And these are folks who are best trained to do the kind of thing that you're going to see in War Game. But Steve would tell people that the Oath Keepers, which was one of the paramilitary groups that was active on January 6th, they were in fact encouraging their members to apply for the Montana Highway Patrol. And
that's
so
right.
We think, okay, did they get radicalized when they were in service? But in some ways, a lot of these groups, the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, the Proud Boys, those are folks that actively reach out. And I think Chris's group is just trying to figure out, how do you inoculate? How do you create a barrier so that people don't have to feel like they have to take that step to still be patriots? And one of the things that you and I know, that when you look at the motivation of many of these people, they don't see it as anti-American. They think
Right.
that this is their patriotic duty to stand up and pick up arms to support, in this case, this general who went rogue, and I think his name was Strickland, right? The person who lost the election. And so, talk a little bit about what those persuasion tactics can be, and how we can maybe lower the temperature for a lot of people who feel really strongly in this country that election was stolen and that they need to pick up arms to defend their country.
Right. Well, I think it's a very important point to make, that the military and the law enforcement community are reflections of society writ large. You know, any issue that exists in society, it also exists in the military. But folks who are in the military, serving in the National Guard, serving on active duty, or our veterans are disproportionately targeted for recruitment by these groups, because they have special skills, they have a standing and credibility in their communities,
and they have a love of country.
And they have a love of country. And, you know, I think, so I want to make that statement. You know, we're not saying that everyone in the military is an extremist by any means. We're just saying that the ones who are targeted have a disproportionate impact on those around them, and an ability to create a lot of chaos and potentially violence. And so I think, you know, one of the things, as I've studied this issue and been more involved over the last few years in understanding how to inoculate, or how to bring someone back off the bubble who's already kind of fallen down the rabbit hole. So much of this stems from a real world grievance. And that's something Elizabeth Newman, who played our Homeland Security advisor in the film and is a former DHS official under Trump, who left the administration. She says this a lot. You know, she's a true subject matter expert on domestic extremism and radicalization, and all of it stems from real world grievances. And for some, it's, you know, coming back from war and not receiving the treatment or care, or being disconnected from community. For others, it's a real or perceived grievance that the government has mistreated them in some way, or taken their rights away. Again, I say real or perceived. And we're seeing a lot of that. I think writ large, we have a problem with loneliness in this country, in particular amongst men. And, you know, so much so, you know, it's not just Janessa, you know, coming up with that. The Surgeon General of the United States has actually launched a public health campaign to combat loneliness, which is a pretty you know, interesting and I think noteworthy thing that at the highest levels of our government, we're seeing this as a real epidemic, and it drives people into corners where they feel connection, online spaces where they feel connection, and that can translate into groups that have a mission to facilitate the destruction of our representative government as we know it.
I think there's so much really great work that's happening out there in various pockets. And I think there's a lot of, you know, if you think about the laboratories of democracy, we have all of these nonprofits, these groups now that are really starting to think about, how do we talk across difference? How do we address these challenges? And I want to put a plug in, number one, for our podcast, The Hot Dish. Elizabeth Newman will be on our podcast. We'll be talking to her, but she's recently written a book called The Kingdom of Rage: The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. An excellent book. I've read it. But there's just so many great Americans who are thinking about this issue, but it doesn't seem to be have risen to a sense of national urgency, right? It's like, I want to just forget that. That was a bad day. Let's just move on. There's all this move on stuff. And, you know, unless you analyze it, unless you treat the symptoms and what caused this, how do you move on? And I think that's really what a lot of us who are participating in this this exercise, which is what you hooked me in. It was only after we said yes to the exercise that we were told we would be on camera, by the way. But that we really think that there isn't a collective sense of urgency, and that's what I hope people take from the film, is that this is real, and it's a real problem in America, and are we really prepared to deal with it?
Yeah, we've seen over the past several years the number of Americans who say, political violence is justified has risen sharply. We've seen a sharp escalation in the rhetoric from, presidential candidates all the way down about, what they're going to do, how they're going to use, how they're going to use the military to implement their policy visions in ways that it hasn't in the past. And I think there's real danger to that. If you're, an everyday person, you're not maybe paying attention to every report that gets put out by, the Heritage Foundation or elsewhere. But the point of this exercise in film, we made a really distinct effort to not make it, a Trump-Biden polarity. We created these two fictional characters. We didn't even say, Republicans or Democrats here. We created two fictional parties, fictional extremist groups, because there are, folks who consider themselves conservatives who are actively fighting against this every day. Elizabeth Newman is a conservative and a Christian woman who wrote that book about the rise of white Christian nationalism. And I think that is extremely brave for folks to stand in their values and say, this is not me, and this is not what I want our country to go down the road. But more and more Americans are accepting of political violence and authoritarian policies and politics. And I think that part of that is maybe folks have never really lived in those places where that is the reality every day. Personally, as a Marine Corps vet and somebody who worked in conflict zones in very challenging countries overseas before I was even in the Marines, I do not want any of that here at home. And I think there's almost this like fantasy level from a lot of folks in our society who are like, oh yeah, a little political violence, and then we'll put things back on the right track.
Thomas Jefferson said it was okay, right?
Well, sure, yeah.
15 years wouldn't be a bad thing. To that point, we had another former member of the military who was part of the Red Cell, who we had actual film footage of him walking through the January 6th protesters. And at one point, he was watching someone protest their country, and his reaction was, I shot farmers in Afghanistan so that you can do this to our country. To me, it's one of the most important moments of that film. It's never made the trailer, which I always thought was really interesting. But to me, that's the moment where if I ever had any doubt that I should be involved in this, that doubt just disappeared, because he can't stand defending this country alone. We've got to all step up. And it's so interesting because there's such I don't know, it's not a desire, but there's such a willingness to admire the problem in this country, but not achieve solutions, right? We just, this is terrible, this is terrible. I hate going to things where all we talk about is how terrible this is. And I think one of the things about this film that is really valuable is it shows that in a room full of people who have done these kinds of exercises before, that there wasn't a level of preparedness. And it makes you wonder, how prepared is the next group? How prepared is the American military, and especially the National Guards across the country, to basically contain any kind of contagion in these circumstances? And, it leaves you with the sense that maybe not as prepared as we should be, right?
I think that's where we're at. I mean, there are lots of great groups out there who are doing, other war games, other tabletop exercises, as they're sometimes called, to try to think through some of the what ifs. At Vet Voice later this year, we're doing with governors, states attorneys general, and National Guard commanders in a few key states. We're going to do similar but much more scaled down versions of these exercises to really stress test the bureaucratic relationships that exist between the policymakers and the Guard. Because if something like the Insurrection Act needs to be used by by either winner of the presidential election in November. Folks need to be prepared and understand their authorities, and a lot of that hasn't been stress tested, other than around things like environmental emergencies or like wildfires or floods or things like that. So definitely something that we think needs to be paid a lot more attention to.
Yeah, and you've got your Marine hat on. I'm going to put my lawyer hat on, and kind of my background really in undergraduate was looking at constitutional history, revolutionary history, and there is something called the Posse Comitatus Act, which basically prohibits the military from getting involved in domestic police actions. So everybody's like, well, why the National Guard's down there, but they're doing logistics on the border? That's because we have a law that says they cannot be members of the police force. We have a private police force. We have a military that defends our country, and obviously a National Guard that helps at times of severe national emergency, but they're not carrying weapons unless something happens where there is an authorization to do that. And the big question is, at what point do you invoke the Insurrection Act? And you may think, well, is that really the point of all this? But remember that General Flynn was trying very hard to get President Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act even before the January 6th basically confirmation of the election. And so this is a really important, it may seem esoteric to a lot of people, but that separation between the American military and police actions in this country is long been understood, but now we're blurring the lines. And that's a lot of what we've been talking about in this war game.
Yeah, and I don't think it does anyone any value to sugarcoat or both sides of this issue. The MAGA movement has put out policy documents and frameworks about how they would use the Insurrection Act to deploy National Guard to blue states to institute law and order should President Trump win in November, how they would utilize the National Guard. Although they can't legally perform law enforcement functions, in a mass deportation scenario, they could be driving the trucks and performing logistics to support operations like that. And so understanding what has been proposed by the movement behind one of the presidential candidates and how that would impact everyday Americans at home on American soil, and what a strong turn that is from the norms that we've come to expect in this country, I think is very important. And it's not alarmist or fantasy. It's been written down and published for all of us to see. And I think people really need to, if they haven't taken a hard look at Project 2025, should take a very strong look at it.
So promo for further on this program, we will be taking a look.
Oh, fantastic.
At Project 2025, but I want people to understand that this is not a norm, it's a law, number one, and it's a law for good reason. And if the public no longer wants that law, the law should be repealed. It shouldn't be willy-nilly. And again, it's an example of how we have over the years created these norms that we thought, oh, no one will breach these norms, but we saw many people crossing the line in many different ways, breaching what would have been traditional norms. And then we saw some heroes, people saying, I'm not going to do it. I think, General Milley is one of those. I think he was pressured to a great deal to get more active get the military more active. I think there's Mark Esper, who is the Secretary of Defense. Elizabeth Newman is one of those people who pushed back and said, no, this is extra legal and we're not going to do it. The question is, and when you look at staffing of the next administration, let's say, and the staffing is people who don't have that historic reference, they are just there to do the bidding of a strong man, that is not going to be a scenario that will be consistent with the democracy.
That's exactly right, and one of, I think, the scariest parts of thinking through a second Trump presidency is just the lack of good people who would be in the room to put those constraints in place.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to make this all about, Donald Trump and, because I think one of the things that the previous Trump administration has really done for us, Janessa, is it has stress tests those norms. I mean, how many times have people said, well, he can't do that.
Right.
That can't happen. And you're like, well, it's happening. So
that's a really positive spin on we're strengthening our democracy by taking it to its breaking point.
Well, but it does. I mean, there is some perverse or interesting logic to it, right?
Certainly.
Yeah. Like I mean, I don't know how many times people have said, I didn't know that could happen. I didn't know that, and I'm like, well, now we know. So what are we going to do about it? And the sad thing is that, and I've said this, that it's not just about Donald Trump. There's been warnings in the past about, returning veterans feeling really unappreciated and, what that means in terms of the homeland and how they might engage in ways that are, in our opinion, inconsistent with the democracy. And so this isn't just about Donald Trump. And it's not just about the January 6th insurrection. And so the key to this is we now have had a huge event in our history, which is January 6th. That huge event in our history has served as a warning. I mean, we survived it, but it has served as a warning. But when people say nothing to see here, move on, that is really dangerous to our democracy.
That's right. And I think it's also exposed some things that are really structural issues that we have sort of paid lip service to over the last 10, 20 years. I mean, the fracturing and disintegration of our media, the fact that we have many Americans getting most of their information from social media, and social media algorithmically rewards rage and vitriol. So you're sort of, as people are getting information, they're getting pushed into these radicalized corners. And then also the fact that, there's real pain in our society. The economic, the gap between the haves and the have-nots continues to grow. And we haven't, I think one of the reasons why people are looking towards more authoritarian leaders, not just in the United States, but around the globe, is that there's this sense of, well, this system isn't working for me. And so people are not irrational. If something isn't working over and over again for them, or they don't see it tangibly in their own lives, it's hard to make the case that the system is the right system, right? And so I do think we have some real frank and glaring conversations we need to have in a more tangible way in this country, and solutions that we need to be more specific about. But we're not even. I don't think we've even scratched the surface on having those conversations, or be in a place legislatively where we can push something forward that has a real impact.
Yeah, I have a favorite saying: "You can't fix a problem you won't admit you have."
That's right.
And I think what this exercise hopefully will do is get more people to think we've got a bigger problem. I want to just kind of add to your algorithm, kind of how this happens. My husband is a woodworker. He's a retired physician. Comes from a fairly kind of conservative state, obviously North Dakota. So check. Woodworker, he looks up videos on how to fix cars. Check. He has all of the kind of algorithms that would tell you that he's a conservative, right? And he will tell me about the pop-ups that he gets on YouTube that are disturbing to him, because number one, they've labeled him as somebody who could be persuaded, but yet the pitches are so overwhelmingly, in his opinion, anti-American.
Totally. Well, I mean, I think I shared with you over the holidays, I got really into gardening and baking. And, after like 2 weeks of looking up recipes on Instagram and like following, gardener accounts on Reels and all of that, I started getting all this trad wife content. Like,
explain trad wife, because a lot of people don't know that.
Trad wife is a movement for traditional wives, which is basically, submitting all of your decisions to your husband. It's got a lot of like very evangelical overtones, a lot of anti-government overtones. I'm like, definitely not the target, but it just proved to me how quickly folks can get sort of sucked into these places that they really were not trying to go, and how dangerous that can be for a sense of social cohesion as a nation, a sense of shared values, and just alarming for sure.
Okay. We're going to use our last bit of time doing some movie promo. So explain where you are right now with distribution of the movie, when people can start seeing it, streaming, how, or in movie theaters. So what's the plan here, Janessa, to get this movie out, this documentary out to a broader audience?
Yeah, well, if you are interested in hosting a screening, if you're tied to an institution or a university or something like that, and you'd like to host a screening, please go to wargamefilm.com. That's our website. It's got a list of all of our future screenings, as well as contact info for how to request that. We will be in limited theatrical release starting August 2nd. We're kicking off in New York, and then we'll be in a number of markets for a very limited period of time, potentially a week, maybe 2 weeks. From there, the film will be available on streaming services like Apple iTunes and Prime. We're hoping that it gets picked up by a major streamer, but the reality is that we've been told that the film is too political, and organizations are nervous about their shareholders and their bottom line. So we plan to get this film out to as many people as we can. We hope to. We are also doing a college tour this fall, about 50 universities around the country, and all of those dates and locations will be up on wargamefilm.com. But we think that this film is best seen in community, followed by conversation. So we'd really like to work with any groups who have grassroots networks that are interested in screening it and having a conversation after.
And I think you will. I mean, some people, when they walk out, they just seem visibly shaken because I think they've put the collective trauma that we were put through on January 6th in the back of mind. And so I think that one of the things in the screenings that we've done together, Janessa, is being able to watch the participants talk about, not doom and gloom, but this is what we've learned. This is how we can all work together. And so I don't want people to think that it's just going to be this really experience where you walk out feeling even worse about the future of the country and the future of our democracy. I think there's a real opportunity for community dialogue afterwards. What can we do? And, one of the things that I've been doing is looking across the country on who's got great programs that are speaking across dialogue, that are speaking in those environments. And what I hope comes from an exercise like this is some additional willingness to have civic engagement that is purposeful, meaningful, and across difference. And,
that's exactly
what we
right.
can hope for, right?
That's right. And I will say the film does have a hopeful element to it and some laugh out loud funny lines, mostly delivered by Senator Heidi Heitkamp.
That's not true. That's not true.
You're the star.
That is not true. I didn't intend to be the star. I just
it's hard for you not to become the star, though.
Yeah. What about the drones? I'll forever hear that from our team. But thank you so much, Janessa. I mean this from the bottom of my heart. I can't imagine a more patriotic American than you. Serving your country as a Marine, serving your country and wanting the best of our values, human rights values, to be expressed across the world, and now doing this work with the foundation. You are a true American patriot and a true American hero, and I am so proud to call you my friend. You are.
Thank you, Senator. Right back at you.
Yeah, love you.
Love
Take
you too.
care. Thanks so
Okay.
much.
I'll see you in
We'll-
DC.
we'll-
Okay.
yeah, we'll see you next week.
Thanks for having us.
You bet.